psychology, and linguistics, because I feel these are three sort of different aspects of the same subject matter. But philosophy has always been something that grabbed me. But of course, in South Africa, we only learn about Western philosophy. So we went into a lot of detail on all the great Western philosophers, like Plato and Kant and Schopenhauer and Hegel, Popper, all these great scholars, which, as you know, Swami Vivekananda was a master of. All self-taught, of course. He read it himself and he knew all their works off by heart. The problem is that there was always something missing from their philosophy. There's always something that they say something really great, really profound, but they stop at the point where it gets very interesting. So one example is, without getting too technical, the German philosopher Kant wrote a very famous work called A Critique of Pure Reason, where he tried to reconcile what's called rationalism and empiricism. He tried to bring these two schools of thought together. So rationalism means that everything we know is from the mind. Empiricism says everything we know is from the senses. Kant came along and said, but it doesn't have to be either or. It can actually be both. And then he talked about something called the transcendental unity of apperception, which means that our perception guides our version of reality. So the way we perceive something and the way we understand something is actually guided by our spatio-temporal perception of that. So Kant spoke about something called the noumenon and the phenomenon. And he said the noumenon is that reality which underlies the world of sensory perception. And he gives the example of a bee. Can you imagine how a bee looks at the world? Can you imagine how a goldfish looks at the world? Can you imagine how a shark looks at the world? So a shark sees the world as impulses of electrical energy. A snake sees the world as ultraviolet rays of light. We as people see it for, I think you know what we see it as. We see it in 3 dimensions. We see it in terms of space-time. And we can't see it outside of that. We can't transcend that. So Kant is the one who actually pointed out that our perception of reality is false, necessarily false. But he stops there. He says that we can't go further and know what's beyond that. If you read Swami Vivekananda, he summarizes Kant's philosophy very nicely, but takes it further and completes what Kant didn't complete, and explains it very nicely using the Vedanta philosophy. Regarding the issue of mind-body dualism, issues of whether the mind is part of the body, whether it's part of the mind or integrated, many Western philosophers grapple with this, and they talk about, like Berkeley spoke about, the world as just one big mind, that there's no such thing as physical solid objects. Then we get materialists who spoke about the body only, that there's no such thing as the mind really, all seems to be the case. But Swami Vivekananda explained it so nicely, based on the ancient Vedic and Vedantic texts. He says that we have soul, ego, intellect, mind and body, all part of the same organism, all existing in different degrees of subtlety. They are not separate. And as you were saying earlier, they're all part and parcel of the same being and they all influence each other. The problem is that the soul consciousness is covered in ego consciousness, which is covered in intellect, which is blocked by the mind. And the body being the most, sort of the grossest form of that, is your biggest obstacle in sort of getting in touch with your soul consciousness. So the more bodily we are, the more we like to eat and drink, and that's why fasting is important, because it helps us to transcend body consciousness. It takes us from body consciousness to transcend everything in between and ultimately get in touch with the spirit. So Descartes was the philosopher who grappled with this idea of mind-body dualism, and he's very famous for writing in his meditations about it. But he never was able to explain how we are able to use the mind to control the body, as our brother was saying earlier on, and vice versa, how the body controls the mind. If you sit down and you actually focus on your hand, you'll feel a certain sensation on your hand. You're able to influence your body to that extent. Swami Vivekananda says that your thoughts manufacture reality. In the Complete Works, Volume 7, he says that your thoughts are like hammers, little hammers that you send out in the world to construct the reality that's there. And he cites one of the Upanishads, which says, you sow a thought, you reap an action. Sow an action, you reap a habit. Sow a habit, you